Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day 15 of our Contigo Wellness Challenge, where we're challenging you to learn more about mental health and implement some of these wellness strategies that have been presented. We're also excited to highlight the work that our amazing Hispanic and Latinx therapists are doing out in their communities. And so we're halfway through the 30-day wellness challenge, and we're really glad you're here with us today. Today, we're going to have Michelle Perea Enriquez here. Michelle believes in the tenets of survivor recovery through empowerment, community care, and holistic survivor-centered approaches. Most recently, she held a role as a trauma therapist at East Los Angeles Women's Center and worked closely with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, as well as stalking for the last 9 years, providing group and individual therapy as well as other power-based violence prevention services through an intersectional lens. During her graduate studies, she engaged in therapeutic work involving families and individuals who were seeking ways to navigate trauma and help guide them to the mental wellness through facilitation of individual group therapeutic support. She obtained her bachelor's degree from California State University, Los Angeles, and also received her master's in social work from California State University, Long Beach, with a specialization in community mental health. She remains committed to maintaining healing-centered practices as she continues her work as a trauma therapist and is currently working on obtaining her license in clinical social work. She is also a level 2 instructor for empowerment self-defense, looks to this work as an embodiment practices to assist others to feel empowered and healing through this type of movement. And today, Michelle's going to talk to us about the understanding of trauma and domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual assault and the effects that it has on the Latinx community. Michelle, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here, Diana. I really appreciate the collaboration and just the willingness, right, to hear a little bit more about what I do and my experiences in working with trauma survivors. I appreciate the intro as well. So, I did want to just share some bits and pieces of trauma. I think especially in this day and age, we are talking a lot about trauma in various ways, right? Right now, we're going through the wave of the trauma of living with the coronavirus, as well as recognizing racial injustices, as well as climate change. So there's a variety of traumas that we are all experiencing collectively. And so I think it's a really good time to really just have a conversation on how it can impact us and ways to heal as well. So thank you again. Trauma, what I usually like to think about is, a lot of people experience and say that trauma looks somewhat like a disconnection, a fragmentation, breaking, so to speak. But, I think sometimes that kind of gives off an image of something that's very fragile, something that can't be put back together, right? A lot of people describe themselves as being broken after experiencing a trauma. So I like to put it in different words to kind of give it a more spiritual connotation, spiritual level to what people go through when they experience some type of trauma. One word that I use for trauma is soul wounds. It can mean or look like a recent or historic event or events that has fractured the harmonious interconnections between mind, body, and spirit that naturally exist, right? So oftentimes, trauma survivors really feel like the trauma has impacted them to the core of who they are, to their soul and their spirit. So some of the things that I've heard them describe their experience was, I feel like my soul left, right? Or I don't feel like myself anymore. And if we're talking about trauma on a collective level, people will describe the impact on them collectively. Our people were never the same after that. And you can see how profound and spiritual it is to really get a sense of how trauma takes away people's ability to kind of connect to themselves, connect to their bodies and their minds as a whole. And so this is where we talk about the holistic centered approach to trauma. It is not just an individual factor, it's not just a group factor, and it's not just a community factor. It's a really just broad range of a societal problem that has crossed different nation states and has crossed globally. And this is another word that I use as well, blood memories, which is intergenerational trauma, just talking about the collective and historical trauma that individuals face. This is one way that we can talk about it, as in, we've talked about how trauma passes on from generation to generation in epigenetics. And this is one way to describe it, as in, it lives in my blood. The memory of this trauma lives in my blood. And so this is where we see a lot of communities that have been impacted by intergenerational trauma, how they repeat cycles of, behaviors of learned experiences, learned ways of thinking and beliefs, right? And there are ways to break out of this as well, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So these are some types of traumas. Traumas can look very different. They can be more interpersonal. So this can involve another person that inflicts the harm or inflicts the trauma, and it can involve external factors. So some interpersonal types of traumas are things such as sexual assault, and that includes sexual harassment. It can include penetration and simple assault. So harassment can look like anything from individuals being verbally threatened. It can look like being exposed to inappropriate pictures. It can be, spoken to in an inappropriate manner about someone's body or sexual orientation, or being asked to do certain favors in exchange for leniency, either through work or school. And it can look, like I mentioned, like penetration or touching of other body parts. Other types of interpersonal traumas include dating and domestic violence. So it's threats of or acts of violence, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, coercive trauma, and intimate terrorism. So when we think about domestic violence, that usually includes a romantic relationship or people that you're involved in, which is dating violence. It's not necessarily somebody that you need to be living with. But domestic violence can also include people that you're living with, such as family members or friends. So that can be included in domestic violence. But what we're going to talk about is more how people relate to each other on a romantic level, and how they've been impacted by some abuse within that relationship. So some of the things, like I mentioned, emotional abuse. So that can look like either being cheated on, being, verbally abused, being insulted. It can include using someone's children, right, to threaten taking away the children. It can include verbal abuse. It can include coercion. So saying things such as, if you don't do this, then that means that you don't love me, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be physical. A lot of people oftentimes identify domestic or dating violence as being physical, but it includes a lot of the times more emotional, just being isolated, being controlled by that person exhibiting a lot of possessive or jealous tendencies. And stalking is another interpersonal form of trauma. Stalking can occur in person or online. Right now with the coronavirus, we're seeing a lot of online or virtual types of abuse that involves stalking, that involves the other person knowing what your whereabouts are without you telling them, hacking into your social media or your email accounts or other types of personal accounts. So we can see how these interpersonal forms of traumas can really affect the ways in which we view each other and the ways in which we trust and form relationships. And another one that's very, very impactful is human labor trafficking. That involves either prostitution, sex work, human trafficking, which involves sexual acts rather than labor trafficking. Labor trafficking, it involves a person doing some type of work in exchange for some type of leniency again. But usually with human trafficking, it does involve some type of work, but it reaches someone on a more sexual level. And this is really one of the most impactful forms of violence, as it exploits the person to their core. So it might involve multiple assailants, right, as they're being exploited for their services, and that can create a lot of harm within that person. And this is something that we see a lot now within our communities, a lot of times people think of it as more of an international issue or something that occurs in other countries that don't have a lot of protection, but this is happening in our own backyard. And I think more and more people are identifying it as something that needs to be combated, and awareness needs to be raised on these different types of trauma and violence. We also have community violence, which includes gang violence, poverty, police corruption, immigration raids, and war. These are things that I think on a broader level, they allow for these other types of interpersonal traumas to occur, because if there is violence all around, then it's normalized. If community violence involves something like poverty or lack of access to healthcare or lack of access to education, it can create a sense of helplessness. It can create a sense of inequity to where individuals might engage in or experience trauma because there aren't a lot of outlets, there aren't a lot of forms of meeting their basic needs. And this can create a lot of other factors that result in, in normalization, in violence against one another. Police corruption. So, a lot of times trauma survivors say, I was seeking help from law enforcement and it was difficult because I was re-traumatized. And so again, we can see how, this type of trauma it's done in a cycle in a way that is very harmful. Then we have, like I mentioned, more external forms of trauma. So things such as natural disasters, accidents, like car accidents or plane accidents, medical traumas. So sometimes individuals experience, either being in the hospital, especially for children, being in the hospital all the time, having to deal with different surgeries, and that can create a sense of fear around being in hospitals, around being anything that's related to a medical setting or medical professionals. So, as we can see, it's still traumatic. It's there is little T trauma, which can look like divorce, a loss of a loved one, to where it is still traumatic for a lot of individuals. They carry this trauma around with them. They carry the weight of the trauma, but it might not be chronic, and it might not be complex, and that it creates a lot of barriers, or it creates a huge sense of loss. When we talk about complex trauma, we usually talk about individuals who have faced ongoing pervasive trauma. So it can start from childhood, to where they're exposed by their childhood sexual abuse or witnessing domestic violence, and then as adults also experiencing abuse. And so there's a sense of feeling trapped. I can't get out of this situation no matter what. And so that feeling of helplessness can translate into dealing with more complex forms of trauma that require sometimes different types of healing, right? But we don't want to generalize what people experience as traumatic, because it looks different for everybody. So a lot of times people will try to compare and say, well, my trauma wasn't as severe as that other person, so I shouldn't have to, I shouldn't be at a place where I'm concerned or complaining or going through whatever it is that I'm going through. But we really can't come to a place where we can judge that person for what they're experiencing. And these are some impacts of soul wounds: emotional, physical, spiritual, because we're talking about the person as a whole. We're talking about how everything is interconnected. So the way in which the body responds or the body is impacted can also affect how someone feels emotionally, and vice versa. For some people, some of the emotional impacts of soul wounds can look like mood dysregulation. So people have a hard time kind of controlling their emotions, or even being in touch with some of their emotions. So a lot of people experience emotional numbness, to where they're like, I don't feel anything at all. And as a result, might engage in behaviors that can bring a sense of feeling alive, or a feeling of a release, right? Because otherwise they're emotionally frozen. Avoidance. So there's a big avoidance of people, places, or situations or conversations that revolve around the trauma. for some people, this can look like avoidance of relationships or avoidance of sexual intimacy or even avoidance of a particular part of town, right? Anything that reactivates that person, they tend to try to avoid. There's hyper or hypoarousal, again, connected to the mood dysregulation, to where people are hyper aroused. So a lot of the times they might easily be stimulated by sound, by conversations, by sights. This can look like someone becoming easily irritated or angry or frustrated or easily, tearful. And with hyperarousal, again, it's the opposite, to where that person is just shut down, that it takes a lot for that person to react. And they're kind of stuck in this frozen mode. People have difficulties with relationships, either maintaining or being in relationships. So a lot of times people say, the sense of mistrust with other people doesn't allow me to form long-lasting relationships, or the sense of feeling worthy, has, for some reason, gets me into these relationships that are unhealthy or abusive, and I can't seem to get out of these types of relationships or try to find something that's a little bit healthier. Difficulties with, family members in not being able to communicate, so communication can change as well. And like I had mentioned earlier, anger or depression is a big way that people tend to try to work with the impact of the soul wound, is in, just being in a mode to where they struggle with functioning. So sometimes even getting out of bed, sometimes eating or finding a good sleep routine, or being tearful all the time can really affect a person's ability to maintain a job, ability to care for their children, ability to care for themselves. And low self-esteem is another big one, to where people feel they're not worthy, or they carry a lot of shame and self-blame that the trauma occurred and it had something to do with what they did or what they didn't do. More and more, we're seeing a lot of body image and eating disorder issues. So a lot of folks kind of connect the trauma to their body. So if my body didn't look this way, then I wouldn't have been I wouldn't have been traumatized. Or feeling a sense of control with eating disorder, body image issues. So the only thing that I can control is the way that I look or the way that I appear. A lot of suicidality and homicidality. So people usually experience either fleeting suicidal thoughts, so thoughts that just come and go. Sometimes people experience ongoing suicidal thoughts that can go on for years, and not necessarily have attempts. They might just have these thoughts. But a lot of the times, when people feel like there's no sense of escape or respite, then the suicidal thoughts might lead to attempting to die by suicide. And homicidality, a lot of individuals experience a sense of maybe feeling homicidal towards the person that did them harm, and having images or fantasies of wanting to harm that person, or just having homicidal thoughts that come up. And I didn't include this in the presentation, but there are a lot of changes in the brain that occur with the impact of soul wounds, to where chemicals that we need to function and to either sleep, regulate our emotions, and memory are impacted to the point where people's brain chemical brain balance is off kilter, and that can really affect how people go about the world and really what they're experiencing in their bodies. Physical issues might be digestive issues, so issues with their stomach. They might have difficulty either using the restroom or using the restroom too much. Headaches, headaches that can't be explained by any physical ailment. Body ailments such as chronic pain. A lot of people might say, I just have this ongoing physical pain. I try different treatments, or I go to the doctor and the doctor says everything is fine physically. Issues with respiratory or heart issues. So a lot of trauma survivors unfortunately experience these respiratory heart issues, and reproductive difficulties. So in the study done by Kaiser, it's called the ACEs questionnaire. it's a set of 10 different questions that people answer according to the traumas that they've experienced before the age of 18. And that study showed that the more that people checked off, the more likely folks were to experience some type of disability, health problem, or early death. Um, Again, because everything is so intertwined that it's difficult, if not impossible, to separate the physical impacts to the emotional and the spiritual. But it's not to say that folks who do have a higher number in that questionnaire, it doesn't necessarily mean that these are things that are going to happen. It's just kind of a way to also normalize, right, childhood trauma and the adverse experiences. And I think with spiritual impacts, those are the most, I think, profound, to where people can lose a sense of lack of belonging or connection to something. A lot of people question their relationship with a higher power because they think, if there is a higher power, then why didn't this higher power save me from this trauma, or get me out of, this depression that results from the trauma? A lot of people experience mistrust with themselves and the world, so they develop a lot of me against the world mentality. And as we know, especially right now with the coronavirus, that human beings are meant to engage in connection, that relationships aren't a luxury, relationships are a necessity. But for a lot of individuals that experience trauma, they no longer feel that way. They might feel that it's safer to isolate, it's safer to withdraw than to engage with the world. And a lot of times there's a sense of mistrust with the self, with I don't know who I am, I don't know what I'm capable of, I don't know what I enjoy anymore, right? And so that can create a sense of helplessness and despair for a lot of people. Bargaining, to where a lot of people, kind of is in the stages of grief, they go to a higher power and they say, if you had done this for me, if you can do this for me, then this might change, right? So there's a lot of questioning, and not being able to accept that this is what's happened, and maybe oftentimes living in a sense of another reality or another world. And it's just a way to protect oneself from the emotional impact of the trauma, of being able to live with it. And people just feel a sense of abandonment. Again, it can be abandonment from their higher power or their ancestors or their communities. And with that, just not being able to really connect to anything that is grounded. A lot of people lose their sense of being rooted. So people have a hard time even engaging in nature or stillness, anything that engages us in stillness, because it just feels too foreign, right? This being in nature might be really soothing, but for some people it's like, this doesn't feel normal to me anymore, it's unfamiliar and I'm afraid of it, right? So just helping people even get through them being spiritually connected to non-living beings can sometimes be hard as well. And these are two hashtags that I've heard about and that I talk about often when I'm working with trauma survivors. On the one side, it's hashtag why I stayed. So this came about when there was the incident with Ray Rice and his wife, and a lot of people questioned why she didn't leave the relationship. She was in a very physically abusive relationship. And so some people decided to kind of change that and change it to why I stayed. So instead of kind of putting the blame on why didn't you leave, it's like, let me give you some of the reasons why I stayed, some of the valid reasons. So some reasons why people stay in abusive relationships. This is where we're talking about domestic or dating violence. There are several. So if we're talking about folks within the LGBTQIA community, a lot of folks say, I stayed because that person threatened to out me and I wasn't ready. Or if they, or for anybody who has a status of living with HIV, the other person also threatened to out them as a person living with HIV. A lot of folks say, because of the children or pets, the threat that that person was going to hurt my children or hurt my pets or take my children or my pets away. So more and more, a lot of domestic violence shelters are recognizing the need to accommodate pets or find ways to maybe collaborate with, animal shelters to find a place for pets, because more and more people, who don't have children, are also concerned about their pets. Those are their babies. And the children, of course, that's another huge thing, right? Where they don't want the separation of the family necessarily. They want to have that ideal family to where the family is connected and is together. Religion is another big piece. Sometimes people's religion, forbids divorce or forbids separation or looks down upon single mothers or single parents. A lot of the times, anything from financial reasons, people are financially dependent on the person that they're with, or fear. A lot of times, people are very fearful because maybe they have tried to leave the relationship and it's resulted in more physical abuse, or even the way that they've been interacting with law enforcement or other support systems that are supposed to provide access and resources to survivors have re-traumatized them, and so they feel like there's a lack of support. They might not feel supported by their family or friends. They might feel judged by their family or friends, and through that lose those connections needed to facilitate leaving a relationship. A lot of survivors who are dealing with immigration status difficulties are being threatened by their partner and saying, if you leave or if you don't obey my rules, I will call ICE or I will deport you or we'll find a way, without knowing that there are protections for immigrant survivors. It can look like anything from, I used to call it love. I don't call it love anymore. For me, it's more of a trauma bond. A lot of folks say, I'm in love with this person. I care about this person deeply. And so they feel a sense of guilt as well in leaving that relationship or reporting that person. But we know that trauma bond is really what keeps folks together. There's this strong sense of connection that the other person understands you. And when people are engaging in trauma, that can really change the chemistry between individuals that stay together. There's this chemical force that really, you know, keeps people in such a place to where the attachment and the brain and everything that occurs all at once has enough of a hold for folks to stay in relationships. Like the other factors that I had mentioned, the broader societal factors that maintains dating and domestic violence and normalization violence against women or children, rape culture, to where it allows for a lot of the survivors or victims to think that this is part of the culture. This is part of the norm, and it's something that they just have to live with and be okay with. And then the other hashtag is why I didn't tell. So this can also be connected to dating domestic violence, why they didn't tell anyone, why they didn't report. But it's also more so about folks that deal with not telling or reporting sexual abuse, and not so much reporting because a lot of folks choose to not report. A lot of times the relationship that they have with the person who has harmed them is a relationship that is very complex, that they can't report. There's a sense of, I'm betraying the relationship that I have with this person. I'm betraying my family, especially if it's a family member. So a lot of the same reasons why people stay in abusive relationships are some of the same reasons why people don't tell or talk about sexual abuse. There might be a lot of stigma or shame around talking about sexual abuse or sexual assault. There might be the sense of me not being believed or me being judged, same as dating domestic violence. That person might judge me for being in this relationship. A lot of the times when it's children who are not able to tell that they're experiencing some type of sexual abuse, it's because there is a lack of understanding of what's going on with me, right? Not really understanding what this violence is. And for a lot of folks who are in communities who have been marginalized and disenfranchised from the LGBTQIA community, to not talking about their sexual abuse or sexual assault because of either individuals not being supportive or reinforcing the strengths of that community, or immigrant survivors of not being able to trust medical providers or law enforcement in handling these issues of sexual abuse. So there are a lot of varied reasons why people don't say anything. And it's a shame, because when people do sometimes come out and share their stories, a lot of times they're dealt with, they're met with, well, you should have said something sooner. So if you didn't say anything when it happened, then it didn't happen. And so again, it really just kind of creates even more trauma for that person. And a lot of the times people don't say anything for years. I've had people come in who are in their 70s who tell me, I have never told anybody that this happened to me years ago. And it brings about a sense of relief that somebody actually believed them, somebody actually heard them, and is seeing them for who they are. They're not just a survivor, victim, or neither, right? A lot of people don't want to identify as a survivor or victim. And they say, I'm more than what happened to me, I'm more than my trauma. And really it's just kind of helping them find themselves again, and identifying the strengths that they've carried around with them as being a trauma survivor is very therapeutic. And these are some ways that people heal. I think connection is a huge one. Community love, this can look like revolutionary mothering, right? So it doesn't mean necessarily that by revolutionary mothering, I'm saying that people don't necessarily have to be mothers to human children, but they can be mothers in other ways, right? So even in talking about mothering, that connection that that person has to someone or something else, and the love that they receive from the community, that's a big form of connection that really speaks to the survivor as not being alone in what they're going through, and to receiving reinforcement and praise in their healing process. Healing circles, so this can look like a support group, right? Or it can look more like a healing circle that's facilitated by a holistic healer, right? Therapy. And these are not one size fits all. So folks might not feel comfortable with going to a therapist, but they might feel comfortable going to a Reiki practitioner or to curandera or curandero, and this is still part of that connection, right? More and more, we're talking a lot also about body awareness and how that person feels within their body when they are thinking or talking about the trauma or reliving it, and really how to kind of engage the body to be able to heal itself, to work from the inside out, right? A lot of the times people lose a sense of connection to their bodies, and so somatic work is really crucial in being able to help people find tools within their own physical landscape to heal from that trauma. Empowerment self-defense, so like Diane had mentioned, I'm a level 2 empowerment self-defense instructor, and with empowerment self-defense I've found profound ways that people have healed. So people have engaged in talk therapy maybe for months prior to taking that class, but once they're in the class, it really brings about a sense of embodiment of the experience. So a lot of the times is we're doing activities that are not necessarily reliving that traumatic experience, but there's some elements of surprise. There might be some elements of building your intuition, some elements of scenarios that might have occurred, and it allows them to really get into that sense of like, this is how I felt, or this is how I'm feeling, and working through that in a safe environment. And again, just really building up their physical strength and that courage and that body image buildup that can help them really feel empowered. So I've seen people leave their unhealthy or abusive relationships. I've seen people stand up to their employer that were sexually harassing them, or have a better relationship with their mothers through empowerment self-defense. It's a very, very powerful tool. And I think this is just for any bodily movement, right? It can be yoga, it can be running, swimming, just anything that engages the body to release a lot of what's kept inside, what's stored in the body after trauma, and to also to build community, right? Because we know there's a lot of running communities and yoga communities that people can be a part of. Creativity is another big way. I think that people are able to engage in a way that gets them in the zone, in a way that gets them to express themselves. So a lot of the times maybe it's difficult for people to verbalize what it is that they are feeling or what they've experienced, but through art, through writing expression, through storytelling, these are some ways that people are able to share their stories. These are some ways that people are able to make sense of what it is that they're going through. And, you know, these are forms of expression that we've had for a very long time. When we talk about the Latinx culture, you know, storytelling was a big piece of this, of our ancestors, and being able to sit around and engage in circle or in council, and being able to share our experiences and to share our creation stories and to make meaning out of it. So, you know, a lot of the time storytelling is really about making meaning out of whatever has happened, or, you know, whatever it is that people are choosing to partake in or find lessons within the storytelling or the mythology. And another very powerful form that I think has really reached out to me has been the ancestral power and connecting with oneself. So this is conversation with your ancestors. So a lot of times people say, I don't really have a lot of support, or I don't really have anyone that I can speak to. But engaging in conversation with your ancestors really allows you to maybe receive some of the answers that you're seeking, to receive some of their guidance, to connect with practices that have been taken away from us, right? And so it's a really powerful tool that you can utilize at any time. Baños or limpias or fuegos, these are other ways that people can incorporate the different elements of nature, with water, with fire, with herbs, with earth, right? And being able to incorporate that as a practice to ground themselves, to really, you know, rediscover parts of themselves in these safe practices, to ask with intention, right? And to speak to the elements and to respect and honor the elements as well. So as much as you are giving, you're also receiving. And you know, for myself, it's my numerology is knowing what my day sign is, and what we call the tune. Every day sign is meant for a specific purpose, and really knowing what your purpose is in life and how you can utilize my numerology in a way that can empower you and can gain a better understanding of where you're meant to be, or some of the things that you know, might want to become familiar with. Praying or meditation, of course, for a lot of people, you know, this is very it really connects you to yourself. It really connects you to your inner world. And there are various forms of meditation. A lot of times people don't necessarily like silent meditation because they're just not there to where they're comfortable with the silence. It might trigger them more so than help them. And so there's, you know, guided meditations, there's more active forms of meditation. And so people can play around with all of these different ways to heal. There doesn't have to be one specific way that people are going to heal. It can be a combination, or it can be more than these. People are very resilient, and people identify what works for them. People are experts of their own healing. And I think that's the beauty of post-traumatic growth. So as much as there is post-traumatic stress, there's post-traumatic growth, to where people can be, they can live in a way that is more profound than they had before the trauma. And it takes a long time to understand. It takes a lot to understand this piece. But you know, as trauma therapists, that's pretty much our role, to really just engage people on their own healing journey.
Wow, thank you so much for all of this information. That was so great. I really liked how in depth you went with trauma. That's so important, and that is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart as well, as a trauma therapist also. So I wanted to ask, have you seen that there's more trauma in regards to domestic violence since the pandemic, or would you say it's about the same?
So we have noticed an increase in different forms. I think what I had mentioned, you know, something that keeps people within these relationships are the finances. As we can see, you know, people are losing their jobs. People are not being able to pay their rent. And so, you know, this increased dependence on folks has really kind of kept some people in these relationships. A lot of times also being afraid of seeking support from either law enforcement or from a shelter, because of, you know, I think the the misunderstanding or misconceptions that a lot of the harm doers inflict on people. So a lot of the harm doers are kind of telling people, you're going to catch the coronavirus if you go and seek help, or you're going to spread it to your family and friends, right? And kind of like not really using like the scientific concepts. It's just kind of like whatever is convenient for that person, for the harm doer, right? And keeping that person within that relationship. So we are seeing that. So initially we did see a decrease, which again, I think was just more of like not wanting to reach out, because that person might also be there within the household, because maybe that person is no longer working. And so they're now both in the household to where that person can't seek support, or that person can't continue going to therapy or to support groups, or to call someone when violence is occurring, right? Whether it's verbal or physical. But as time has passed on, we've seen people kind of, again, getting the resources in another way, us trying to be creative in the ways that we reach the community and letting them know like these resources are still here, and these are the ways that we're trying to make sure that you stay safe, and as well as financial resources. So people are starting to come out, but we are starting to notice like there is an increase in, for different reasons. I think it was the same thing with sexual assault. There were very little calls to like the hotlines for hospital accompaniments. And at first we were wondering why. And again, maybe the fear of going inside a hospital to be examined because the spread of the coronavirus, being exposed to it. But a lot of the times was also depending on who their harm doer was when it came to the sexual assault or sexual abuse, also not wanting to alert the person that they were seeking help. And there was something else that came up that I was going to mention. A lot of trauma survivors are not talking about either being re-traumatized because of the sense of uncertainty about what's going to happen. The isolation was a big piece. So people were just like, my usual support systems that help me heal are no longer, set in place or the same as they were before. So now everything is virtual, and a lot of trauma survivors are, like they say, like they're being zoomed out, or, they might not have access to a lot of the technology needed to engage in these like support groups. So that's also an issue that people have been having. And something that I found interesting, but definitely makes sense, was people saying that there's also a sense of relief because now they feel as if, the general public, maybe people that haven't been through trauma, are now understanding what it's like, right? Because we can see like, the coronavirus is now a trauma for everyone, and people are like now anxious and now feeling depressed, or, whatever it is. And, so now trauma survivors are like, yes, this is what we feel all the time, right? So yeah, it's a little bit of both, but it's, again, we're just finding ways to be creative with, still being there for trauma survivors.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Well, this was really insightful. So thank you so much for, for providing us these tips and your expertise. And we hope that you found this information helpful. We'll leave Michelle's information if you want to reach out to her and learn more about her work.
Diana, I appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.